You've heard of the soldiers who stormed the beaches. You know about the pilots who ruled the skies. But there's a group of men who faced death every single day of World War II. And most people have never heard their names. They weren't Marines. They weren't Navy SEALs. They were merchant mariners, ordinary civilians sailing cargo ships across oceans filled with German U-boats. And their death rate was higher than any branch of the American military. Think about that for a second. Higher than the Marines at Iwo Jima, higher than paratroopers dropping into Normandy. These were regular guys, teenagers and grandfathers, sailing tankers and freighters, knowing that at any moment a torpedo could rip through the hull and send them into freezing water. The odds were brutal. 1 in 26 merchant mariners died during the war. Compare that to 1 in 34 Marines. And here's what really gets me. They weren't even considered military personnel. No uniforms, no veteran status, no benefits when they came home. So why did they do it? What was it like out there? And why has history almost completely forgotten them? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change how you see World War II forever. The convoys that crossed the Atlantic weren't just dangerous. They were floating coffins. Hundreds of ships packed together, moving at the speed of the slowest vessel, which was usually about 8 knots. That's barely 9 miles per hour. Imagine being on a ship, surrounded by darkness, knowing that somewhere beneath the waves, German submarines are tracking your every move. You can't see them, you can't hear them, but they're there. The Germans called it the happy time. That's what they named the period between 1940 and 1941, when U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. In those 2 years alone, German submarines sank over 1,000 merchant vessels, 1,000 ships, each one carrying food, ammunition, fuel, tanks, aircraft, everything the Allies needed to fight. And every one of those ships had a crew. Let me tell you about a ship called the SS City of Benares, September 1940. It was sailing from Liverpool to Canada, carrying 90 children being evacuated from Britain. Families thought they were sending their kids to safety. 4 days into the voyage, in the middle of the night, a German U-boat fired a torpedo. The ship went down in 30 minutes. Of those 90 children, only 13 survived. They spent hours in the freezing Atlantic, some in lifeboats, some just clinging to wreckage. One of the survivors, a boy named Derek Capel, was in the water for nearly 8 hours. He was 8 years old. When rescuers finally found him, he was barely conscious, hypothermia shutting down his body. This wasn't war, this was something else entirely. The thing is, merchant mariners knew the risks. Everyone did. The newspapers reported sinkings almost daily. Families would hear the news on the radio, ships lost, crews missing. But the convoys kept sailing, because without them, Britain would have starved and the war would have been lost. Britain imported almost everything: food, oil, raw materials, weapons. The island couldn't survive without those supply lines. Winston Churchill himself said that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat threat. Not the Luftwaffe, not the German army, the submarines. And he was right to be scared. At the peak of the battle, U-boats were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Do the math on that. You're losing the war, not on the battlefield, but in the ocean, one cargo ship at a time. So here's where it gets interesting. The Allies knew they had to do something. They couldn't just keep sending ships out and hoping for the best. They needed a strategy. That strategy was the convoy system. Instead of ships sailing alone, they would travel in massive groups, protected by warships. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates. The idea was simple: strength in numbers. But here's what they didn't tell you. The convoy system actually made merchant ships more vulnerable in some ways. Sure, you had protection, but you also had dozens of ships packed together, all moving slowly, all following the same route. For a U-boat commander, It was like shooting fish in a barrel. Picture this. You're a merchant mariner on a Liberty ship, somewhere in the middle of a convoy. There are 40 ships around you, maybe more. It's night. Pitch black. No lights allowed because lights attract submarines. You can barely see the ship ahead of you. Suddenly, off to your left, there's an explosion. A freighter has been hit. You see the flash, hear the boom, watch as flames shoot up into the darkness. Men are screaming. The ship is going down, but here's the nightmare. Your convoy doesn't stop. It can't. If you stop, you become an easy target. So you keep going, sailing past men in the water, past lifeboats, past the burning wreckage. You keep going, and you pray you're not next. That was the reality. Every single day. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't they just avoid the U-boats? Couldn't they zigzag, take different routes, outrun the submarines? They tried. Convoys would change course constantly, zigzagging across the ocean, trying to throw off the U-boats. But here's the problem. German submarines hunted in wolf packs. Multiple U-boats working together, coordinated by radio, surrounding a convoy, attacking from different angles. One U-boat would make contact with a convoy, then radio the position to other submarines in the area. Within hours, you'd have 5, 10, sometimes 15 U-boats converging on a single convoy. And at night, they would surface and attack. Why surface? Because on the surface, U-boats were faster. They could outrun most escort ships, and in the darkness, they were almost impossible to spot. Radar wasn't good enough yet. Sonar only worked underwater, so a surfaced U-boat at night was basically invisible until it fired. The convoy commodore would order the ships to scatter, every vessel for itself. But merchant ships weren't built for speed. Most could barely do 10 knots, and they had no weapons worth mentioning. Maybe a deck gun, maybe some machine guns, but nothing that could stop a submarine. So you'd scatter, and you'd pray. That's all you could do. Let me give you some numbers that'll put this in perspective. In 1942, German U-boats sank 1,664 ships. That's more than 4 ships every single day, for the entire year. Do you understand how insane that is? 4 ships a day, every day for 12 months straight. And it wasn't just the sinkings, it was how men died. Torpedoes would hit without warning. The explosion would tear through the hull, ripping apart bulkheads, flooding compartments. If you were below deck, you had maybe seconds to get out. Most didn't make it. If you did get out, you hit the water. The North Atlantic in winter is cold enough to kill you in 15 minutes. Not from drowning, from hypothermia. Your body just shuts down. You're wearing a life jacket. You're conscious, but your muscles stop working. You can't swim. You can't shout. You just stop. And if you made it to a lifeboat, you might drift for days, weeks even. There are stories of lifeboats found months later, just skeletons in life jackets. Men who survived the torpedo, survived the water, but couldn't survive the waiting. One of the most haunting accounts comes from the SS Gulf America. March 1942. She was torpedoed off the coast of Florida. Florida. Not the middle of the Atlantic. People on the beach watched it happen. They could see the flames, hear the explosions, watch men jumping into the water. And they couldn't do anything. The U-boat surfaced and fired on the lifeboats, on purpose. Shot at men trying to escape. 19 crew members died. The survivors said the U-boat commander just watched as they burned. That's what makes this so hard to understand. These weren't soldiers. They were civilians, mechanics, cooks, engineers, deckhands. Some were teenagers, signing up because the pay was good and they wanted adventure. Others were old men, too old to be drafted, but young enough to work. And the government needed them. Desperately. By 1943, the United States was building ships faster than any nation in history. Liberty ships, cargo vessels that could be constructed in less than 2 weeks. They were churning them out because they knew so many were being sunk. But ships without crews are useless. So they recruited anyone who could work. Farm boys who'd never seen the ocean. Men who'd been rejected by the military for health reasons. Even criminals, released from prison on the condition they join the merchant marine. They trained them for a few weeks, taught them the basics, then put them on a ship and sent them into the Atlantic. 16-year-olds sailing into a war zone with less training than a grocery store clerk gets today. And here's what blows my mind. They kept volunteering. Even after the newspapers reported the losses, even after everyone knew the odds, men kept signing up. Why? The pay was part of it. Merchant mariners earned good money, double or triple what a soldier made. Combat bonuses too. If your ship sailed into a war zone, you got extra. If you got torpedoed and survived, you got even more. But it wasn't just the money. Talk to the survivors, read their memoirs, and you'll see something else. Duty. They knew Britain was starving. They knew American soldiers in Europe needed supplies. They knew if the convoys stopped, the war was lost. So they went, over and over. Some mariners survived 5, 6, 7 torpedo attacks. Got sunk, got rescued, went back out. One guy, a radio operator named James Whalen, survived 3 sinkings in 6 months. 3 times, his ship went down. 3 times he made it to a lifeboat. And after the 3rd time, he signed up for another voyage. When someone asked him why, he just shrugged and said, "Somebody's got to do it." That attitude, that quiet courage, that's what won the war. Not just the big battles, not just the famous generals. It was men like James Whalen, doing a job that needed doing, even though it might kill them. Now, let's talk about something the history books usually skip. The technology race. Because the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just about bravery, it was about innovation. Whoever had the better technology won. Early in the war, the Germans had the advantage. Their U-boats were faster, quieter, more advanced than anything the Allies had. They could dive deeper, stay submerged longer, and their torpedoes almost never missed. The Allies were playing catch-up. They had sonar, but it was primitive. They had depth charges, but you had to be right on top of a submarine to use them. They had aircraft, but planes couldn't fly far enough to cover the entire Atlantic. There was this area, right in the middle of the ocean, that aircraft couldn't reach. The Germans called it the Black Pit. No air cover, no rescue planes, just merchant ships and U-boats. And in the Black Pit, the submarines ruled. Then something changed. Technology caught up. The Allies developed better sonar. They created radar that could detect surfaced U-boats at night. They built escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that could sail with convoys and provide air cover in the Black Pit. And they cracked the German codes. This is huge. The Germans used Enigma machines to encrypt their radio messages. They thought the code was unbreakable. It wasn't. British code breakers at Bletchley Park figured it out. Once the Allies could read German messages, everything shifted. They knew where U-boat wolf packs were forming. They could reroute convoys to avoid them. They could send destroyers to hunt submarines before they even attacked. The Germans never knew. They kept using Enigma, kept radioing positions, kept coordinating attacks. And the whole time, the Allies were reading every message. By 1943, the tide had turned. U-boats that used to sink ships with impunity were now being hunted themselves. Allied escort ships became aggressive, using new weapons like the Hedgehog, a mortar that could throw depth charges ahead of the ship instead of just dropping them behind. And the numbers reflect it. In May 1943 alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. 41 in 1 month. That's more than 1 per day. The Germans called it Black May. Admiral Dönitz, The commander of the U-boat fleet pulled his submarines out of the North Atlantic entirely. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. The Allies had won. But here's what gets me. Even after the Germans retreated, merchant mariners kept dying because there were still U-boats out there, still mines in the water, still dangers everywhere. The convoys kept sailing, and men kept drowning. Let me tell you about the SS Richard Montgomery. She was a liberty ship loaded with 1,400 tons of explosives, sailing to Europe in August 1944. The war was almost over. D-Day had happened. The Allies were pushing through France. The Richard Montgomery ran aground off the coast of England. They tried to save her, tried to unload the cargo, but the tide and weather made it impossible. The ship broke apart, and those 1,400 tons of explosives? Still there, right now, today. The wreck of the SS Richard Montgomery sits in shallow water near the Thames estuary, with enough explosives on board to create one of the largest non-nuclear blasts in history. If it goes off, it would shatter windows 20 miles away, maybe even trigger a tsunami, and there's nothing anyone can do. The explosives have degraded over 80 years. They're too unstable to move. So the British government just monitors it, hoping it doesn't explode. That's the legacy. Even now, decades later, these ships are still dangerous. But let's get back to the men. Because after the war ended, after VE Day, after the parades and celebrations, the merchant mariners came home. And America forgot them. They weren't considered veterans. The GI Bill? Didn't apply to them. VA benefits? Nope. College tuition? Home loans? Medical care? None of it. Because technically, they were civilians. Think about that. Men who had higher casualty rates than the Marines, who kept the supply lines open, who risked their lives every single day, came home to nothing. No recognition, no benefits, nothing. Many of them struggled. They had nightmares, PTSD before anyone called it that. They'd wake up screaming, thinking they were back in the water, back in the darkness, waiting for the torpedo. Some couldn't talk about it. They'd spent years at sea, watching friends die, and when they came home, nobody wanted to hear the stories. People wanted to celebrate, wanted to move on, didn't want to think about the ugly parts of the war. So the merchant mariners stayed quiet. They got jobs, started families, lived normal lives, and slowly their stories faded. It took until 1988, 43 years after the war ended, for the U.S. government to officially recognize merchant mariners as veterans. By then, most of them were dead. The ones who were still alive finally got their veteran status, their benefits, their recognition. But it was too late for thousands of them. Here's why this matters, why I'm telling you this story, because we forget. We think of World War II as the big battles, the famous moments, the heroic charges. We forget the quiet courage, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The merchant mariners weren't trying to be heroes. They were just doing a job, a dangerous, terrifying, necessary job, and they did it knowing they might not come home. There's a memorial now in New York City, near the water. A sculpture of merchant mariners, sinking beneath the waves, reaching up for help. It's haunting, beautiful and sad at the same time. If you ever get the chance, go see it. Stand there and think about what those men went through. Think about the convoys, the U-boats, the explosions, the cold water. Think about the boys who lied about their age to sign up. Think about the old men who volunteered even though they didn't have to. They kept the world fed. They kept the soldiers supplied. They kept the war effort alive, and most of them died without anyone knowing their names. So now you know. Now you've heard their story, and maybe, just maybe, you'll remember them. The forgotten warriors of the sea, the men who sailed into hell and brought back hope.